if you're locked inside of an elevator or something, and there's five guys that want to kill you, they're probably going to kill you, but you're going to take down about three of them. You know, so because you're the more desperate person, you want to live, and that's what they had at the Alamos. They had cornered guys that were desperate to live and were going to take down everybody they could. And I think that's what happened.
We're joined today by Ron J. Jackson Jr. There's a lot of Ron Jacksons out there, but this is the only Ron J. Jackson Jr. How are you doing today?
Good, thank you. Good to be with you, Eric.
Good to be with you. Now, Ron, you're going to come on and tell me about something that I've kind of heard about my whole life, being the Alamo, but it's like, okay, well, I don't know. There's Sam Houston, there's Davy Crockett, there's all these figures and things, but I don't really know exactly what the hell happened on the Alamo. Can we get a crash course in the Alamo?
All right, I'll give you the Cliff Notes version. So, of course, the Battle of the Alamo was all part of the Texas Revolution, and it was kind of the seminal moment in that revolution because the Alamo was wiped out, and it was a classic last stand, which captivated the world. That story at the time, it went overseas, and the Alamo became this pilgrimage for this, place of liberty, the cradle of liberty, as Texas would call it.
Now, Texas was a country at the time, correct?
Texas was a province of, it was the province of Tejas, which is part of Mexico at the time.
Okay.
So Texas at that time, or Tejas, the province of Tejas was opened up to settlement by the Mexican government because that was their northernmost boundary. And so they opened it up to anyone that came in that pledged allegiance to the Catholic Church and to the Mexican government. And so you had a lot of Americans, of course, just by proximity, that thought this was a great opportunity. And so they came into the area and really began settling it just as the Mexican government wanted. At some point, they became paranoid that it was too many Americans wanting to do what they wanted to do. One of the issues was slavery, although Mexico was kind of hypocritical on that point. It was illegal to own slaves in Mexico, but they had a whole peonage system and everything. And frankly, they turned a blind eye to a lot of people bringing in slaves, and a lot of slave owners from the South of America, South or in America, kind of skirted it by having like 99-year contracts for their servants, that sort of thing. So basically there were slaves there. But I think that the greater point was that they had a lot of American-minded people who, kind of rebelled against certain things, control from the central government of Mexico. And one spark kind of led to a prairie fire. And so all of a sudden you had a revolution on your hands. And basically, the Battle of Behar, which took place in December 1835, you had the revolutionaries, these Texans that were uprising, take over the Alamo, which was being used as a kind of a military outpost, and basically told the military to get out. And so they put their tail between their legs, go back to Mexico. And Santa Anna, who was the general / dictator, basically hightailed it up north, and actually got up there so quickly in one of the fiercest winters they'd ever experienced, with conscripted soldiers and everything. They had marched from the interior of Mexico all the way up to what is now today San Antonio, Texas, and laid siege to the Alamo. And it was a bit of a surprise that they had gotten there so quickly. And so they holed up in the Alamo, these revolutionaries, and that's what started the famous 13-day siege, and then the March 6th, 1836 Battle of the Alamo, which became kind of the bloody flag that they raised when they went and basically won at San Jacinto and got their freedom at that point. So that's kind of the nutshell. And within the Alamo, a lot of people, the three main people that were in the Alamo was William Barrett Travis. He was a co-commander who wasn't known like the other two I'm going to mention. The other co-commander was Jim Bowie, the famous knife fighter that the Bowie knife is named after. And then the famed frontiersman and former congressman, David Crockett. And those were the three most iconic people that were known. Of course, Crockett by far was the most well known
He
to
was out of
everyone.
Kentucky, right?
He was out
Originally,
of Tennessee.
Tennessee. Sorry.
Yeah, yeah. And he had just gotten ousted from his congressional seat, and he had a famous line. He said,
"You all can go to hell. I'm going to Texas."
And so that was part of his, that was part of his, speech.
He took that well.
He would say, yeah. So he came down with a group of men to Texas to start a new career, maybe go into politics.
You see, Travis, it's a long story, but the meat of it's this. The numbskull voters in Tennessee wouldn't send me back to Congress for another term. And I figured your little war here was the next best thing to Congress.
But he threw in whole hog, as they would say, for what was going on down there. And he ends up inside the Alamo. And
now you wrote about the Alamo from the perspective of a slave, Joe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Joe was Joe has been known since 1836. What hasn't been known about Joe is that he was one of the handful of survivors. What hasn't been known about Joe is where did he come from and where did he go? I've called him like a comet. Like for one moment in time, he kind of appears and then disappears. And back in going back a ways here, but in 1997, I started researching blacks at the Alamo. There were a handful of blacks that were at the Alamo. A couple of them survived. At least one woman we know of died there, based on Joe's accounts. And so I was always fascinated by Joe. I was always fascinated. I thought if I could go back in time and interview one person, I would want to interview this man here, because not only did he survive, he saw everything and lived to tell the tale, but he was also from the eyes of a slave. And I thought there was a really compelling thing there. So I started going historically in search for Joe. And my dear friend Lee White, who co-authored this book with me, she has an ancestor that died at the Alamo, and we share the same passion. And so we just kind of, we were such good friends. We just tag teamed on this research, and it was like this historical investigative research team, just the two of us, and we would theorize, and we'd take the handful of sources we had, and our goal was to piece together Joe's life, because nobody had ever been able to do that. And within a year, which was amazing, we actually stumbled across a slave narrative by a man named William Wells Brown, who was from St. Louis. And Joe, we know from probate records that we found down in Texas, his master was a man named Isaac Mansfield. He was a tin manufacturer in St. Louis, about 1832. And so we traced, we weren't sure if Joe came with Mansfield, or we wasn't sure what that connection was, but we knew that Mansfield was in St. Louis. So we followed that trail to St. Louis through paperwork and came across randomly. I found a book called Ain't But a Place, and it was about early writings of African Americans in St. Louis. And William Wells Brown, a section of his narrative was in there. And I was reading it. I was in a OU library, University of Oklahoma library, like right before Christmas. Nobody's there. I'm upstairs by myself. And I'm flipping through these pages, and I start reading this narrative, because I'm looking for, slave, that's about the time period that our slave would have been there, Joe.
So you're just trying to find out what life was like, even not necessarily a direct connection,
right.
just
right. Paint a picture of what that would have been like. And he says, like on page 5 or something, he says, this terrible thing happened. I'm paraphrasing, but my mother Elizabeth, my brothers Joseph, Milford, and so on, were sold to a tin manufacturer named Isaac Mansfield in St. Louis. And at that moment, and those were the same names from the probate we had found, like almost a year earlier in Texas, the same names in the probate. And so we knew at that point that I'm reading Joe's brother's narrative. And
Wow.
his story is amazing because he was one of the, I mean, if you take away Frederick Douglass, he was probably the next most known abolitionist. He had escaped to Canada, learned how to write, wrote the first African American novel by
Hmm.
any American. It's called Clotel. It's about the president's daughter. And anyway, long story short, uh, what are the odds of that? Somebody said, well, that must have been 1 in 1,000,000. Well, I can tell you right now, it's probably 1 in 12 million that we would find that the slave that we were researching was related to this man. So all of a sudden, we had this window to his childhood plantation and where they originally came from, which was Kentucky. So Joe was born probably he was definitely born in the year 1815. We don't know the date. William Wells Brown was born in 1814. And so through William Wells Brown, we were able to get this window into this whole childhood, which just totally opened up the book for us.
It also would help you for genealogy research, right? I mean, because now you've got a definitively known figure and
Right.
descendants. It would be much
Right.
easier, I would think, to track down.
Yeah. Of course, at the end of Joe's story, long after the Alamo, we track him to Alabama, which is where Travis was from. There's a whole story there. And he had never been there. So he actually made this, it's like a 40-day journey by foot, swimming the Mississippi to go to Alabama to tell Travis's family of his fate at the Alamo.
Oh, wow.
And there's stories from Alabama within the Travis family talking about this slave appearing at the doorstep and telling the story. And it was the first, I know it sounds kind of amazing, but this was about 2 years after the battle, 1838. And it was actually the first time they actually had any hardcore eyewitness, because, back then it was letters or whatever, or something you read in a newspaper. I think that's how they found out that their William Barrett Travis had actually died at the Alamo, was through newspapers, So it's an amazing story. But in Alabama, I put ads in newspapers. I got on a radio station. I mean, I went down there several times trying to find his descendants, and I'm pretty certain there's descendants probably within 50 miles of where he was. So, and the story is that the oral tradition is that he died down there and is buried in a unmarked grave on the old Travis plantation.
So did he become Joe Travis?
Yeah, that's how people knew him. But, back then, like when he was with Mansfield, like the court documents would show Joe Mansfield,
Mm-hmm.
and his original owner was a man named John Young, Dr. John Young, who was in the Missouri legislature. So he, probably back then he was probably known as Joe Young, but in the end, I think he was known as Joe Travis. Whether he kept that after freedom, I don't know, and I'm assuming he lived after freedom. I mean,
I was going to say, did he ever get his freedom?
Yeah, I can't say that for sure, but based on the stories and everything, it sounded like he lived to be an old man. No, he did. I'm sorry, he did, because there's one article where he goes back with Travis's brother to San Antonio and kind of walks, the grounds there. But at that time, it's like 1905, so it's like a modern city at that point compared to what it was in 1836. So he did live to his freedom. Yeah, well, brain fade there.
Oh, no worries.
So, yeah.
I happened to just glance now, and I was noticing that there's no. You mentioned his brother. I saw his brother, and then they said Joe Brown, but then there's no Joe Brown. There's a Joe Travis. Well, I was like, interesting how it came about.
Yeah, William Wells Brown was when William was escaping to the north. He had a Quaker family that took him in and kind of saved his life. And he was starving and everything. And at that moment, he decided he would take the man's name, and the man's name was Wells Brown. So he went by William Wells Brown the rest of his life in honor of the man that helped save his life and allowed him to get to Canada.
Wow. So now, did Joe have any descendants?
Well, I tried to find descendants, and I haven't been able to find any, but we don't even know if they know a lot of families really don't know. If you go back past grandma or great grandma or whatever, a lot of families can't even go back that far. Anybody, whether they were related to slaves or not. So I'm not sure if they know, or if they know, they may not think it's that big of a deal, or they may not have stumbled across my book or, anything. Like I said, I put ads in local newspapers down in Southern Alabama, and was on a radio show, and, kind of searching for any descendants. Um, yeah.
That would be amazing.
But,
Now,
mhm.
post Alamo. So, okay. So Texas, I always know is a weird one because it, was part of Mexico and then it became a country, and it looks like it was a country for a very little period of time, very narrow period.
Republic of Texas.
So how did that go down? So the Alamo, is a horrible holdout. Most people died. Was that a case though that while they lost that battle, it helped them to win their independence because of the bad public image? What went down? Why is it important?
People have to remember too, back that time in 1836, Texas, it's kind of like, it's really kind of like a network of rural communities. I mean, I don't remember the exact number, but there really relatively weren't that many people in Texas.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of people were related to other people or married into families. And, it's just like a little small town where, you marry someone's neighbor and now all of a sudden you're kind of family, and then there's cousins and that sort of thing. And so I think when not only was it an inspiring, holdout where, for 13 days they held out, and even the final battle, even the Mexicans and the Mexican officers praised the Texans up and down for their courage and how they were not an easy, get. You had the personal connection. So it was, for instance, right after the Alamo, Susanna Dickinson, who's kind of been known as the messenger of the Alamo, she was one of the widows of a gunner named Almiron Dickinson, and she had a baby, and she survived, and she's put on a donkey or a horse and sent to Gonzales, which was the nearest town where Sam Houston, who was the general of the Texan Army, is located with part of the army there. And Joe escapes from the Mexican guard and runs out into the prairie and finds Susanna, and they kind of throws in with them, and they go all the way into Gonzales together. And when they get there and deliver the news that, all these men had died, probably nearly 200 men had died at the Alamo.
How many Mexicans died?
That's kind of debated, but I mean, the numbers vary from 1,000 to a couple thousand. I mean, it was, and there were wounded and everything. So
was it like the Battle of Thermopylae in Texas?
Yeah. In fact, it was compared to that a lot. Was the Battle of Thermopylae. But when they got to Gonzales and delivered the news, all they heard that night was just wailing and crying from all the women in town, because there was at least 32 men that came from Gonzales that got into the Alamo on the second they rode in.
I figure this is just about every able-bodied man in Gonzales, sir.
How many rode with you?
I brought you 32 good men, sir.
A few days before the final battle, and they were all killed. So you can imagine, just in one swipe, a whole community of all these men, their husbands dead, brothers and fathers and, cousins or whatever. So that kind of gives you a little sample of the fire that was inside of the Texans at that point. A lot of them wanted to ride right away and fight the Mexicans, and Sam Houston kept pulling them back strategically till he could find the place that he felt was best to fight them. And it was at San Jacinto near Houston.
General, I'm the man who left Travis there.
I do not enjoy waiting any more than the next man, but I will not sacrifice Texas.
Houston, where they decided to finally make the stand, and they wiped them out in like 18 minutes. And they literally, they caught the Mexican army off guard, and they literally, there was just butchering. I mean, they just, it was a pretty bloody reckoning. So.
Wow, that's scary. Now, did they get reinforcements from neighboring territories or states
At the Alamo?
after the Alamo? Like
Oh,
I
well,
don't know if that kind of thing was so famous that
yeah.
some people would go volunteer and want to get be a part of that action.
Yeah, so, I mean, there's stories of some people coming into to Texas later. There's also, I think you had, I actually think you had like U.S. military kind of on the border of Louisiana, but there was still some political, when do we get involved? When do we not get involved? And as it turned out, they didn't need to. But and before that, there were people coming in and signing up for the Army at different stations and were sent to different points. And so it just happens that some of the men that signed up in Eastern Texas were sent to San Antonio by fate, and they end up inside the Alamo. And by fate, Crockett was one of those men that rode in there. And there's some accounts of him really taking a leadership role and cheering on the men and kind of rallying them. But nobody there wanted to die, obviously. I mean, it wasn't some like suicide mission or anything. But people always ask me, I said, well, how did 200 some odd men who are defending a place that's like 2 football fields, and there's no way you could defend something like that. And some of those people were even sick. They were in sick bay. So probably in those 200, I don't know how many. But so every man was counting. But I've told people that the way I just think of it is, if you're locked inside of an elevator or something and there's 5 guys that want to kill you, they're probably going to kill you, but you're going to take down about 3 of them, so because you're the more desperate person, you want to live. And that's what they had at the Alamos. They had cornered guys that were desperate to live and were going to take down everybody they could. And I think that's what happened.
Were they more skilled as well? I'm asking because the follow-up battle with Sam Houston might imply that the training was on his force's side.
Well, the Mexican army was supposed to be one of the best in the world at the time, but they had a lot of conscripted soldiers too. So when you go into these little villages and you're like, hey, you and you and you got to come with us, and there's a bayonet pointed at you. I don't know how motivated those guys are going to be. They probably just want to go back home and live, Whereas the Texans, they got their families on the frontier. They know that, if they go, everybody behind them is going to be in trouble, and so you're fighting for your family and your home and your life. So I think the motivation factor was definitely on their side.
I haven't done a ton of research, but you've done so much research of the time. You've written about boxers later in the 1800s, a ton of Old West stuff. I'm under the impression that the feelings about life and survival were different then. Like, we look at some of the battles in the Civil War where it was just pure carnage, where they literally were walking into a wall of bullets, and they did it because it was the honorable thing. Was that mentality part of what was going on there? And what was the mentality of people at that time?
Well, I mean, I think death was a lot more common, and it came earlier. So I think in some ways, I think people from that era, when you were, 14 or something, you were a man. You were working the farm, probably when you were 12. So because life was shorter, there wasn't like, oh, I'm 58 or 57, and maybe I got 20 years or 30 years to go. They didn't think like that. So death was a lot more common then, especially out on the frontier. But I don't know. That's kind of the way I look at it. I mean,
that's interesting. I was looking at the Barbary Pirates, the wars in.
Mm-hmm.
And I happened to look at like all the generals and everybody who were involved, and they were dead at 40, 42, 46. And it was just like, I would say, the oldest was like 46, 48. And that seemed to be relatively common. And then I go all the way till the end of the century, because we've covered like Lizzie Borden. And these were times that people were posing with their dead relative who had just died. And I'm kind of curious about it. If they were used to death and they're comfortable with death, and not only because they might have, lost 2 or 3 brothers in childhood disease or whatever, like Billy, you're Ron, right? You might have been the third Ron because the first 2 died as infants. But also people, well, they killed their own food. And I'm just wondering if that just made them more comfortable with death, if that makes sense, and more ready to serve the Lord, because there might have been more religious things like that.
Yeah, I think they were definitely more acquainted with death. I mean, if you go back and look at old cemeteries and stuff, you'll see, like you said, you'll see several babies that didn't make it. And can you imagine how hard that was? And then if you're living on the frontier, not only is that a hard life period, you're on your own. There's no grocery store down the road. You're getting your own food. And then you may have to deal with Indian raids or something like that. So that happened a lot too. Out on the frontier, you're kind of left exposed if you're not maybe closer into a town or something like that. But so yeah, so life was just shorter and harsher, and I think they had I don't know, from the old stuff I've read, it sounded like they actually had a kind of a real healthy respect for it, and maybe because they had to, I mean, nowadays there's so many things. We've got medical that can help us live longer, and all the science behind foods we can eat and all that kind of stuff.
Well,
they didn't have all that
convenience.
stuff. Convenience, exactly. Yeah.
I mean, air conditioning. I like it.
Yeah. And that's a relatively new thing, really.
Oh yeah.
So.
Oh yeah. Now, okay. So after Sam Houston won, they became a republic. What was that about, and why such a quick turnaround from republic to then joining the union? Or have you studied that?
Yeah, not really deeply, but I mean, I know that I think everyone they were happy being in their own country, But as time went on, it just seemed like probably more of a natural fit to join the United States, because many of the leaders down there were from the United States. They grew up on the people that were involved in the Texas Revolution. They grew up on stories of the Battle of New Orleans, and their grandfathers were in the Revolutionary War and stuff. So they grew up with those traditions and those stories, and they carried that kind of American sense of freedom back then. And so I think that was kind of more of a natural progression, was for them to eventually join with the United States and stuff.
It just seems so rapid, because you were talking about 1836, and then they came into the Union 1845.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, it's like 9 years later. Boom,
Well, and there's lots of stories about well, this is all planned, and it was all the United States planned to steal this Mexican territory and all that. I don't think it was that easy. I mean, I'm sure there was talk of that for sure, but I don't know. I never really thought there was like some big plan to steal the territory or anything. But the research on Joe putting that story together was, I don't know if I told you this, but it spanned 11 years. Lee and I spent 11 years piecing together and going down, we call them rabbit holes. Every rabbit hole we went down to piece together this man's life. And it was a really epic undertaking. So much that the journey was as memorable as actually publishing the book,
How do you go about researching like that? Do you just pour through like every periodical at the time, in everywhere that you think he may have lived or was? And do you have like a genealogical aspect to it in research too? How does that break down?
Well, the first thing we started with, the first thing I always start with is, what do we know? So like we had, for instance, we had newspaper accounts of the Alamo falling, where Joe's mentioned, he might be mentioned. There was a diary from a man named William Fairfax Gray, who's at a place called Washington on the Brazos. That's where all the leaders of Texas signed the Declaration of Independence on March 2nd, 4 days before the fall of the Alamo. And so after the Battle of the Alamo and they go to Gonzales, they eventually make their way east to Washington on the Brazos. And that's the first time that the leaders of Texas got to hear what was really going on. And Joe was the one that was answering all the questions. In fact, the man, William Fairfax Gray, remarks in his diary that he did it with very, very remarkable, eloquent words. I'm kind of paraphrasing him, but he told them in very plain English what happened and how it went down. So there was that. There was William Barrett Travis had a diary for a certain period of time that mentioned Joe Mansfield and this Isaac Mansfield, which was so we took the primary sources that we knew, which was, relatively few, maybe 15, 16 pieces of different parts. And from those, we started digging deep. And so when we would go into courthouses and stuff like that and follow these rabbit holes that we would call them, we would literally start with like deed book A and go all the way to deed book Z, looking for, a list of names even, because we didn't know what Joe was called and so anywhere we could get information that was primary sources was where we went. And most of this book is written with primary sources. So it's from the period. It's a letter, it's a diary, it's a newspaper account, it's an interview, somebody who knew, Isaac Mansfield or something like that, that everything was pieced together like that. And then the other part of it to bring the story to life is to, of course, research the place and the time. So a lot of the places like St. Louis and San Antonio, they become characters. They're always characters in my book. Whenever I go into a place, they're characters, and people need to know what life was like in these different places. So not only are you learning about Joe's life and where he goes and where the kind of fate carries him into the Alamo and he survives there, but it's also what life is like the law, the slavery laws and everything. So, I mean, all of that is in there.
So cultural considerations and traditions and
just everything about life, wherever they, and what was life like in St. Louis at that time? Well, St. Louis was a big slave market there, and a lot of slaves were being shipped down south. And so, like, for instance, when Isaac Mansfield carries Joe and his brother and his mother and two younger siblings down south, William Wells Brown has a very emotional passage in his autobiography about the last time he saw his family. And he never, to our knowledge, he never knew whatever became of them. He just knew they went deeper into the South, which was basically, like The Walking Dead. You were just gone. You were living, but you were just forever gone. And there's no evidence he ever found them or even knew what happened to his family.
Was his life better in Texas than it would have been in St. Louis?
I think where his life was, quote, better, and I hate to say that with a slave, because I don't think
sure.
you know what I mean in context. But and Lee and I learned this. William Wells Brown and Joe were part white. They were mulatto, and they were supposedly related to Dr. John Young, and so those slaves usually got better treatment. So they became house servants or manservants. And Joe clearly had all the the markings of a manservant. I mean, the diary from William Fairfax Gray talking about how well he spoke and everything. In other words, he wasn't just a field hand.
Right.
You know, he
Maybe
was probably
educated
more.
even.
Yeah, for that. Yeah, I mean, on some level, he was. He was handling the saddlebags and helping get the horse ready and maybe driving a carriage or something like that. And so, from that standpoint, he had a better life than just the regular field hand who worked up from sun up to sundown. That all said, he was still a human who was owned by someone else.
Well, of course, and I'm not.
Yeah, yeah.
No, excuse
No,
me.
I know. Yeah.
I was wondering if his life might not have been better, and obviously on a scale or in a spectrum, but the fact he went to Alabama to tell the Travises implies to me a certain degree of loyalty or care that he had for Captain Travis. And maybe I'm wrong, but could he have been free? I mean, if whoever supposedly owned him or whatever was killed and he survived, I mean, what would stop him from just going anywhere?
One thing, and I'm talking about over a decade of study of slavery.
Mm-hmm.
We found time and time again that relationships varied from really intimate relationships with slaves to harsh brutality of the worst kind of torment and everything. So kind of everything in between. And with Joe, and like you said, it's hard to imagine that he didn't have this sense of loyalty. If he's gonna, you're talking about going through. I know for a fact he had never been to Alabama, and he went 40 days across the southern territory of the United States, swam the Mississippi. You're talking about slave patrols. I mean, just the wildlife, marauders. I mean, whatever else is out there. And he goes all the way over there to tell the Travis family the fate of William William Barrett Travis. And so I can't help but think that they had some sort of,
bond.
Bond. Yeah. And I also would not be shocked at all if he was somewhat rewarded for his loyalty. I'm not saying that he wasn't still owned, but they probably he lived there. That's the story, is that he lived there with the Travises. So they took him in. He probably had a certain job or whatever that he did there, but he might have been quasi-free or something like that. I noticed too in that period, and this happened with William Barrett Travis, but one of his properties that was sold after he was killed at the Alamo, the property, and this is all in the probate and everything, came with one of his slaves, John. So you got the property, and then you got, old John, who lives in the cabin at the corner of the property. And so I think there was a sense of,
well, that whole property thing was a problem too, because I could be wrong, but from my understanding, like Thomas Jefferson very much wanted to free his slaves, and some other people wanted to free slaves, but Thomas Jefferson had severe debts. That's why we have a Library of Congress, as he sold his entire library to the United States to pay bills. And he could not technically free the slaves because he was indebted. It's like he was in hock. All of his property was, owed to debtors, and that sadly included slaves.
So the economic, that's the total economic issue there. And if you go back and look at Thomas Jefferson's writings, he was he tussled with the issue of slavery. I think he was the one who said, we have the wolf by the ears. They weren't sure how to let the wolf go, kind of thing. But he said he wanted to free the slaves, but I got the impression too that he was never in a position economically where he was going to take that kind of hit, to let the slaves, go. But yeah.
Wow. To wrap up, I like to ask this question, which is, what is the one question I should have asked you, but I neglected to?
Well, I don't know about should have asked, but I know one question that comes up a lot with Joe is, did we consider him a defender or just like a innocent bystander, like a child or something, some innocent bystander that miraculously survived, because he was almost killed. A Mexican officer beat off a couple guys that one shot him in the, tried to bayonet him, and another one took a shot at him. And this officer beat him back because he recognized that he was a slave, and they, quote, weren't warring against slaves. So that probably saved his life. But, when Travis, when the Mexicans attacked that morning on March 6th, Travis yells to Joe to grab his shotgun and follow him. And he follows him up to the north wall, where Travis is shot in the head, falls back, and is eventually killed. And so Joe retreats to a little part of the Alamo, and through a window, through this haze and this noise and everything, fires a couple of rounds from this shotgun. I think Joe was, I've always considered him a defender, but not in the same sense as a David Crockett or a Jim Bowie. I think he was a defender of Joe. And I think he was doing everything he could to live. And I also think that, I think he had probably added everything up and thought, I'm kind of better off with the people I know here than I would be with the Mexicans, because there were a lot of stories about, Santa Anna and his brutality and stuff like that. So I don't know if any of those survivors even thought they were going to live. They probably just thought they were all going to be executed. But that's just my 2 cents on Joe. I always thought he was a defender, but like I said, in a little different sense than a Crockett or a Bowie.
No, if he wasn't a soldier, and so I could see that. It's like.
But a lot of those guys that were in the Alamo were just volunteers. They just, they were farmers. They were, one guy owned a hat store, but they were, they grabbed their rifle and they joined up with their neighbors to defend what they thought was the right thing, So, yeah.
Well, awesome. Thank you very much. Now, the book you wrote on this is actually Joe the Slave Who Became an Alamo Legend. And
right.
I will have a link to that, definitely, so people can.
And I'd like people to know, too, if it's all right, Eric, if they want to order any of my books, especially if they want it signed or anything, it's www.ronjjacksonjr.com. Okay. And I'd be happy to sign books or something and send them off to whoever wants them. So.
Awesome. I'll definitely put a link to the site on there as well. And Ron, thank you so much.
Thanks, Eric. Appreciate it.